Good afternoon. I'm Danny Harris. I'm honored to be the Executive Director at Transportation Alternatives, and thank you all for joining us today for a conversation about the 25 by 25 challenge that TA was honored to launch just a week ago today with now over 116 coalition partners. We're really excited for really talking about the future of the city and thinking about streets as an asset in support of our shared recovery. I'm honored to be joined shortly today by Yesenia Mata, who's the Executive Director of La Colmena, Julie Samuels, Executive Director at Tech NYC, Christopher Schuyler, who's Senior Staff Attorney to the Disability Justice Program with New York Lawyers for Public Interest, and Julie Tai, President of New York League of Conservation Voters. They'll be joining shortly in conversation. And first, what I'd like to do is just walk you through the 25 by 25 initiative. I hope many of you have had a chance to see it. And if not, just like to give you a broad overview of our vision here, our shared vision for the future of New York. So quite simply, what we've put forward is a challenge to incoming electeds to reimagine our streets and specifically to repurpose 25% of our street space by 2025. My name is Danny Harris. Again, I'm Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. And quite simply, what we're looking for is how to think of our streets and sidewalks differently, something that serves as an asset for all of New Yorkers instead of a liability. Transportation Alternatives has been around for more than almost 50 years. We have been working in partnership with residents across every borough of the city to reimagine what our city could be. So we think about how we can give streets back to people, and in doing so, create better opportunities for people to walk, bike, and support public transit. We recognize that our organization is not simply about buses and bikes, but it's about public health, it's about racial justice, it's about economic opportunity, it's about addressing climate change, it's about creating a more livable city. Quite simply, we see our streets as assets that can provide everything from more street space, can provide more green space to communities in need, can help us to address environmental inequities, and can address commuters who have, especially healthcare workers who have the longest commute time in all of New York. So right now, it's important just to take a bit of a census of our spatial allocation in New York City. Right now, New York City has over 19,000 lane miles for driving and over 3 million free parking spots. While I know that those of us who have a car or have driven in a car, you may feel like no matter where you are in New York, there's not enough space. But the reality is we have more than enough space, especially given the fact that only a minority of New York households own a car. And just as one example, for every one car registered in New York City, there are 1.5 free parking spaces available to that driver. Just in comparison, for every 116 bicycles in New York City, there's only one bicycle parking spot. So clearly we're talking about an inequity that addresses so many things, but especially about our spatial allocation. When we look right now, about more than 75% of our public right-of-way is devoted to the movement and storage of vehicles. There's almost a rounding error that relates to protected busways and bikeways. We obviously have about a quarter of our space is devoted to sidewalks, but for those who've tried to get around and see sidewalks are covered in scaffolding or mounds of garbage or sidewalks that are inaccessible, whether you have limited abilities or you have a stroller or a wheelchair, quite simply, we need to be creating more space that serves all New Yorkers. So right now, we see a huge moment to start to reimagine our street space in support of the no shortage of challenges that are facing the city, from the budget crisis to racial injustice to climate change to COVID. We see that obviously the work that's been done in this city, not just over the last year during COVID with the expansion of open streets and open restaurants, but really looking over the last 2 decades, where we've seen some incredible and transformational work that has taken place in parts of New York City. Now is the time to scale it to all of our city. And as we specifically talk about the cost, it's important just to look at what normal costs us right now. So right now, the landscape of New York City, which again is devoted to the movement and storage of vehicles, costs our city, these are just a few of the numbers, $1.7 billion in opportunity costs, just in terms of hours and time that's lost and people getting around. Traffic crashes cost our New York City economy over $4 billion a year. And we know that these numbers are amplified, especially in low income and communities of color. When you look at Asthma Alley up in the Bronx, when you look at the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID and also recognize that one in 10 children in New York City have asthma, with a lot of that obviously being tied to particulates in the air. It's clear that we cannot continue in the normal fashion that we did before, and we must think about ways that our streets again can drive value back to our city. So quite simply, again, we're looking for ways that we can imagine every intersection, every street as something that can provide value to our residents. So we've been incredibly fortunate since we launched last week. We have grown our coalition. We are now over 115 coalition partners across a number of industries and backgrounds and across every geography of New York. We have 5 mayoral candidates that have already shown support for this challenge. We have over 11 city council, borough president candidates, again, who have accepted or responded positively to this challenge. And excitingly, we've seen over 10 other cities around the country, whether it's Seattle, St. Louis, or LA, use this prompt to start to encourage their elected leaders to be doing more with street space. So it's important to talk about what this is going to look like. So in our report, which I encourage all of you to take a look at, and we can put the link up in the chat here, we're not talking about exactly what this will mean on every block or what it will mean in the boroughs, but quite simply what New York City could do with this space. 25% of our street space is equal to roughly 13 central parks. Just imagine what that space could do in your neighborhood, on your block, in your borough, across the city more generally. So what we've started to do was just hypothesize. Again, these are not prescriptive. This is just simply doing some math that if we took the amount of space, 25% of which is again devoted to car movement and storage, what could we possibly have? And the numbers are incredible. We could have a protected bike and bus network. We could daylight every intersection. We could provide more street trees and public space. We could have over 1,000 miles of open streets. We could have more space for business, for street vendors, for arts and culture. We could create dedicated space outside of every subway station so that these are community hubs that are about multi-mobility. So imagine being able to ride up on a bike and have safe and secure bike parking waiting for you while you get on the subway. And when you come out, there's green space, there's street vendors. These could be vibrant hubs that help to drive economy, but also help to reconnect our city, especially in an incredibly challenging period. We could help to monetize, we could help to bring money to our budget by monetizing the curb. So even if we were to bring paid parking to just about a quarter of all the free parking spaces in New York, we could generate, even conservative estimates have upwards of $1 billion a year. That also includes creating dedicated freight space for drop off and delivery, for freight operators, and also to take garbage off of the sidewalk and put it onto the curb. The reality that every single block in New York needs to be covered in mounds of growing trash is not a reality. That's not a normal. It is something that we can fix. And so when we think about, again, all of the things that we're proposing here, we're not talking about hyperloops and flying cars in the future. We're simply talking about scaling so many of the incredible things that New York City and our peer cities have done and bringing it again to every resident across the city. We want, again, our residents in the city to have a voice over what could go in their neighborhood. And specifically, we're talking about at least 2 parking spaces on every street where the community could determine what should go there, in addition to how these other amenities could play out. We fully recognize that 25% is not going to be the same across every neighborhood. A place like the financial district may require more than 25% to address the assets that it needs. In other neighborhoods that may be a bit more suburban, it would be less. Again, this is not prescriptive. This is simply just a vision of what could be. And within the report, we modeled out a number of how these impacts could address a variety of archetypes across New York. When we look at commute time, which according to Raj Chetty is one of the single biggest indicators of moving people out of generational poverty, and we also look at healthcare workers who have the longest commute time in New York City has some of the slowest buses in the nation. When we look at some of the transformation in things like 14th Street that have moved from one of the slowest buses to one of the fastest, we simply think that these are the changes that can help to support our most vulnerable, especially low-income and communities of color, those who primarily rely on the bus or could start to use bicycles more often, especially if protected bike lanes were available and bike parking. So we think that this is a net asset for all workers, especially for our most vulnerable. When we look at our streetscape, especially for those who are living with a disability, and we know that about 10% of New Yorkers have a disability and a significant percentage of those who do have ambulatory disabilities. This is an opportunity to reimagine our streetscape and give it back to those so that all of us can get around. And this means not just curb cuts and taking trash off of the sidewalks. This means dedicated space and access for accessoride, so that those who need to rely on additional ways to get around have those access, can have clear access to the curb. We need to be bringing in obviously more accessibility into our public transit system as well, but also as we start to bring in more micromobility operators or continue to expand City Bike, how can we provide more accessible tools within micromobility and biking so that it does work for all, especially for those with disabilities? So quite simply, we need to think of our streets again as not just serving somebody who may be 30-year-old and fit and can run across a busy intersection, but thinking about all of those, especially for those who have disabilities, for children, for older adults. And if we do so, it obviously makes our streets better for everybody. When we think about the significant public health challenges that are being faced across our city, from 1 in 10 children who have asthma to high levels of heart disease and stroke, which are even higher among low-income and communities of color, what we're talking about is cleaning our air. If you look at what's happening in places like London and Paris with their massive transformation, they're leaning into it around air quality. And they recognize that vehicles, in New York's case, are the second largest contributor of GHG gases. And even as we think about the future of cars, whether they're electric or autonomous, the reality is that the particulates that are coming off of those vehicles still get up into the air and cause serious damage. So we need to be thinking about cleaning our air, and in doing so, it'll help New Yorkers breathe and it'll help us to thrive. Also, it's important to mention that traffic-related deaths are the leading cause of injuries of children under the age of 14. Also, these numbers are incredibly high once you get to for populations that are over 50. Traffic violence is an epidemic across the city. In recent polling that TA has done with Siena College, we found that 30% of New York voters have been injured in a traffic crash, and 70% know somebody injured or who's been killed in a traffic crash. These numbers grow if you are Black, if you are over 50, if you're in a household that makes under $50,000. And for residents of Staten Island, 48% of Staten Island voters have been injured in a crash, and over 88% know somebody injured who has been killed. I mean, these are astonishing numbers that should be, in and of itself, these should be the reasons that we make the change. And when we layer all the other components to it, we need to be thinking about our streets differently. We cannot go back to normal, where again, we're sort of building our city around these growing fleets of SUVs and trucks that are putting New Yorkers at risk. And we're also not naive to believe that when we do make these changes, which need to start with bringing protected bike and bus access, so that as we are giving people more options immediately to get around, we also recognize that it can change the way that people do drive. The goal of 25 by 25 is not to create a car-free New York. It is not to take away people's vehicles. It is quite simply to give them better, more sustainable, more equitable, cheaper options to get around. If you live in a community where the only way for you to get around is to own a car, which AAA estimates costs upwards of $10,000 per year in operating costs, advocates and those who are giving you options haven't failed you. The city has failed you. The car companies have failed you. The oil companies have failed you. Quite simply, we want to give people more options so that when they do need to drive, and we recognize that whether you're a delivery worker or you're an emergency service worker, or yes, you live outside and you want to come into the city and enjoy a day, or you have children, or you have limited abilities, or you're an older adult, of course people are going to have vehicles. This can also make the situation better for them with things like congestion pricing that's hopefully coming, thinking of a pricing curb. It gives people who have options opportunity to get out of their car and use other ways to get around, which means that for those who do have to drive, it can make your experience more pleasant. It can make it easier for you to get to where you're going. It can remove some of the congestion. So, and this is also backed by the data. When we look at induced demand, as we have presented here, we're not just, whether you look at what's happened in Times Square, or even what's happened with congestion pricing in other cities, this really does change behavior and it creates more positive situations for almost all groups. And again, going back to the polling, what we're talking about is not just good policy, but it's actually good politics. Again, when we did this work with Siena College, what we found when asking New York City registered voters was that they wanted more amenities in their neighborhood, even at the expense of fewer car lanes and parking spaces. And those last 2 points are key, because we weren't just asking whether you like bus lanes or whether you like bike lanes, or whether you like street trees, but we specifically wanted to know if people wanted them in their neighborhood, even if it meant removing another, maybe in their mind, asset. which was a place to store your vehicle. And what we found was overwhelming support across the boroughs, across demographics, across ages, even in many cases across whether somebody owned a car or not, that there were things, particularly, having safer intersections, having dedicated busways, having dedicated bike lanes, where there was overwhelming support across the boroughs. So we see this as, it's not just that this is good policy, but this is what New York City voters are asking for. And according to polling that came out of DOT, which was not among New York City voters, in some cases, the support was even higher. So as we sort of think about this moment in time and we look towards, our future and think about a new mayor and new members of council, we quite simply are putting forward this challenge that not only can we not go back to normal, not only can we not go back to normal the way it was, but we need to bring equity to our streets. We need to bring a new form of management to our streets. And most importantly, we need to bring about a new vision where our leaders will prioritize human beings instead of inanimate objects, in this case, cars and trucks. And again, it's supported by no shortage of data, which I hope that you'll take a look at our report and see in more than 40 pages, we lay out a really robust case for 25 by 25. And we were incredibly fortunate because as we built out this campaign, we've now engaged almost 250 community partners, from individuals to organizations to businesses across the city, to help not only inform and strengthen our report, but also understand the realities of what this report means for a diversity of groups and interests and neighborhoods. And we are incredibly heartened because it has strengthened our report, and we are incredibly eager to continue to grow our coalition and grow the work. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your time, and I'm most excited to welcome our panelists who will engage in conversation with us now about 25 by 25 and sort of how they see their future. So if I could just ask, so I'll just do another quick intro. So Yesenia Mata, who's Executive Director of La Colmena, if you could just turn your cameras on. Then we have Julie Samuels, Executive Director at Tech NYC. Christopher Schuyler, who's Senior Staff Attorney to the Disability Justice Program with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And Julie Tai, who's President of New York League for Conservation Voters. So I'm incredibly grateful to have you all with us today. And I'm just kind of curious, as a starting point for each of you, is you each represent and advocate for various groups in New York City. And I'm just curious about how, from your perspectives, you would categorize the state of our streets in New York, and specifically how it resonates with your membership and your audience. Julie Samuels, can we start with you, and then we will go to Julie and then Christopher. And Yesenia, I'm not sure if she's on, but if she is, we can go to her last.
Sure, thank you so much. Thanks, Danny, thanks, TA, not just for having us, but for your incredible advocacy on this issue that's so important, to all New Yorkers. And I think, when we talk about all New Yorkers, that's why Tech NYC, the organization I run that has over 800 members, tech companies, investors in the city, really care about this issue. I mean, I do personally, as a parent and a New Yorker, but even putting that aside for a second, the thing about people who work in tech in New York is that they're New Yorkers first, as opposed to some tech workers in other parts of the country. People come here or they grow up here and they want to be part of all the things that make New York amazing and unique and interesting. And having access to our streets in a healthy, safe, constructive, and frankly, fun way is a huge attraction point for a lot of people in the tech industry here, particularly when you think of some other cities that are, important tech cities. That's also true with transit, which hopefully we'll get to later. All of which is to say, to the extent that we're concerned about ensuring that tech jobs, the jobs that are obviously the jobs of the future, are here in New York, what we've seen happening across the country and the world is that the tech companies will relocate wherever the people they want to hire are. And it's incumbent upon us as New Yorkers, I think, to ensure that those people are both New Yorkers who are raised here, but also people who want to be here. And safe streets, fun streets are a big piece of that. So it's all kind of like this cycle that builds upon each other. And it's like the streets, it's the most core part, literally the most core part of the city. So we think it's crucial for the future economic growth of New York City. We think it's crucial for ensuring that we have the jobs, frankly, in the tax base to support the city going forward. And we're so happy to be a part of the advocacy that you guys are leading on here.
So we, as the New York League of Conservation Voters, are really excited to be a part of this effort to make 25% of our streets available for by 25 for other items, because this is really about clean air, which you talked about a lot, and reducing congestion and fighting climate change. And right now, we feel like our streets are really prioritizing cars and parking and not focusing on what we can do to reimagine our street space, which really needs to be done in our public spaces, so that we can start addressing these various issues. Because you cannot tackle climate change without tackling the transportation sector. You know, you mentioned that it's the #2 cause of climate pollution in New York City. Well, it's the #1 cause in the country and in our state, causing about 36% of our carbon dioxide emissions. And it's a huge cause of particulate matter pollution, which is really what impacts respiratory illnesses. We see that a lot, in particular in low-income communities, communities of color that suffer the worst. They have longer commutes, as you mentioned. They have worse air pollution and higher asthma rates. You talked about 1 in 10 New York City residents having asthma, much of which is attributable to the transportation sector and other air pollution. But in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, for example, it's even higher. It's over 13%, where you have this confluence of major highways with very poor air quality as a result of that. So to us, it's like we need to start reprioritizing this space, because it is about clean air, it is about environmental justice, and it is about fighting climate change.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, we just at New York List for the Public Interest, we want to thank you for the opportunity to have us on today, and we were just really pleased to support the 25 by 25 report. Before I answer the question, I am a person who stutters. And so, but to kind of get into it, I mean, with when we talk about sort of the state of streets in the city, you know, we're really excited to sign on to the report with the goal of repurposing, you know, 25% of street space, which is currently used for cars, in that, Danny went through the sort of percentages earlier, but to have 75% of New York City streets devoted to cars, and then less than a quarter devoted to sidewalks, not to mention less than 1% devoted to bus lanes, speaks to real kind of inequities. Considering there's, you know, a minority of New Yorkers own cars, and many more New Yorkers, including people with disabilities, need accessible sidewalks, and can benefit from specialized bike lanes and bus only lanes. And Danny kind of mentioned earlier, you know, the possibilities of accessoride specialized lanes or lanes that accessoride can use. So kind of improving mobility for people with disabilities. And New York Lawyers for Public Interest always wants to highlight that what benefits people with disabilities. There's a real intersectional sort of philosophy, and what benefits people with disabilities benefits all New Yorkers, including senior citizens and others with mobility impairments, not to mention parents who are pushing strollers, or individuals pushing groceries or delivery drivers. Basically, what benefits people with disabilities benefits all New Yorkers. And reallocating one of the city's greatest resources, our street space, to more pedestrian spaces would be a huge benefit to people with disabilities as well as all New Yorkers.
Thank you. I mean, in the report, obviously, again, not being prescriptive, but we laid out some ideas of what New York could have, from 500 miles of protected bike lanes, or 500 miles of protected bus lanes, 1,000 miles of open streets, car-free blocks outside of every school. I'm just curious if maybe you could share with us either something, maybe something that you think you're particularly excited about, especially as it relates to the work that you do. And also if there's something that's left out or something, another asset or amenity that you would like to see on our streets, especially to support your organization and your members. Julie Ty, can I start with you? And then why don't we go to Chris and then close with Julie Samuels?
Sure. So, we support this because it's going to be creating the more public space and improving our air quality and public health and helping to slash pollution. And I think the two things that come to mind most for us is one is getting the bus and bike lanes going, protected bus lanes or dedicated bus lanes. Because as I mentioned before, we can't drive our way out of the climate crisis, right? We need to give people alternatives. We know already that when the buses are more reliable, people are more likely to use them. We know that the MTA is committed to going to zero emission buses by 2040, which is fantastic. Hopefully with some of this federal funding we're getting, they'll be able to actually meet their commitment now to do 500 buses this particular capital plan. But really having those bus options, no matter what, is going to be much better in getting people around New York City. And having the bike lanes to give people more options. I think you mentioned this earlier, but more people than ever are using bikes right now to get around New York City, which is great. And I think it's a real opportunity, and we can learn from some of our sister cities in Europe in particular about the viability of that as a way for people to get around town in a way that's much cleaner. And now we've just authorized e-scooters as well, and we're doing some pilots to figure out how that can work, that can help connect people with mass transit or just to get to their destinations. I think those are all things that are alternative options for getting around New York City that are less polluting. The other factor that is both from a particular matter perspective and for fighting climate change. The other area that we're really excited about is using more of this space for street trees and open space. Trees in particular really help to absorb carbon. They also help to absorb just plain old air pollution, which is really tremendous, while also helping to reduce the urban heat island effect. And we also know that a lot of places, it's going to be very difficult to put in a big new park. Where are you putting the next Central Park? Not likely to happen anytime soon, but you can reclaim street space and make that more available for recreation. And that is something that can help with park equity, as well as, ensuring that people really care about this and have a place to go and get outside. Something I think we realize more than ever during this pandemic. So those are sort of the things that are really top of mind for the league and for our membership.
Am I next? I heard
Oh,
it. You go ahead. I'll go after you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Yeah. And I guess I was listening to Julie kind of talk about those points, and I was thinking about how again they sort of the disability community benefits from a lot of the same ideas, and the vision in the 25 by 25 report kind of is really kind of important to the disability community when you think about increased kind of options for transportation and mobility for people with disabilities as well as others with mobility impairments. So if we can find more space for protected bike lanes and bus lanes, not to mention increased pedestrian spaces and open streets, it allows people with disabilities and others to have another option aside from the subway system, which still hovers at only just above 25% accessible with elevators. So the subway station or the subway system is largely inaccessible for people with disabilities, and for those that brave the system often run into all kinds of elevator problems and other issues. So to provide the potential to use bus lanes and as protected bike lanes, as City Bike and other e-scooter companies are coming in and providing accessible options for bike share programs. To have all this protected above ground space is a real important kind of asset to people with disabilities who should be entitled to every opportunity to take part in in the post-COVID recovery of the system in terms of building back the city and returning to work and all that. So these ideas are very important to the disability community.
So sorry, guys. It's confusing with two Julies, in my defense. I would just, listen, both Chris and Julie said a lot, frankly, of what I would say, particularly the kind of specific issues. But there's one thing I would layer on top of that we're thinking a bunch about in light of COVID. And it's what the city and getting around the city looks like if work doesn't look how it used to look pre-COVID, which is to say, what if we all don't go to the same set of office buildings in the same neighborhoods 5 days a week? What if we have more flexible schedules? What if we maybe go to an office in the central business district 2 or 3 days a week, and 2 or 3 days a week we go to an office closer to where we live? How do you get around? So much of the city, is built along the kind of, frankly, century-old subway map that we have. And we have this real opportunity to rethink some of that, but we're not going to be able to, rebuild the entire subway system. It's going to take bikes. It's going to take e-scooters. It's going to take bus lanes. It's, all the things that we're talking about here. So not just, it's important for all the reasons everyone is talking about, but it's also this really great opportunity to rethink where we go and how we get there in a way that could be incredibly meaningful for so many different reasons for the city, for economic development in other neighborhoods, for kids who are growing up in neighborhoods where maybe there hasn't been a lot of economic opportunity to introduce those kids to different types of careers, mentorship, internships, if you start working in different parts of the city and you do it in a way that, you want to do it in a way that we all work on it together, in collaboration with existing communities. But if you get that right, it's a real opportunity for New York City. And part of why I'm so bullish on 25 by 25 and all what we're talking about is I think these things all come together as we look, there's going to be a new administration, obviously, and there's like a lot of opportunity for this big picture thinking. And to me, that's really exciting.
So on that point, Julie Samuels, I guess as I get to sort of the final question, and then I encourage to people to post questions in the chat. I was curious about that in particular. I think in the past, we've seen more siloed issues, especially around transportation. And I think as we're starting to see a hopeful change in that space, especially looking at the federal level of, talking about the intersection of transportation and racial justice or the environment or equity. I'm curious, I know we're all sort of in different organizations where we can't endorse, but I guess I'm curious from each of your perspectives of how you would hope that our next mayor would think about sort of the intersection of some of these issues so that, again, we're not just talking about the environment or the economy or disability rights or transportation, but again, we're thinking a bit more holistically.
Yeah, well, I think even just having a mayor who recognizes that the importance of kind of the cross-pollination that you're talking about is going to be crucial. Getting out of the moment we're in is going to really be an all hands on deck moment. And I do worry about the political moment we live in, that it's very much like it feels like you have to pick a group, but I feel really strongly that unless, you have folks representing all of those interests at the table, building big, sometimes uncomfortable coalitions, we're not going to be able to solve the big problems that New York City faces in 2021 into 2022. I'm confident we can do that. Like, these are the conversations we need to have. So I feel really strongly about that. From the tech sector specifically, because that's why I'm here. I kind of said this at the beginning. I can't emphasize this enough. listen, what we're seeing in I used to live in San Francisco. I was dying to come back to New York, but I used to live in San Francisco. When I lived in San Francisco, no one ever thought the tech companies would leave. It wasn't like a thing that could happen. And I don't know if folks have been paying attention, but they're all leaving. And while I guess there are some people who maybe are happy about that, like that's not, empty office space, employers leaving is actually not good for the city in the long run. It would not be good for New York City either. Tech companies are coming here because, again, the people they want to hire are here. But this is the point I'm trying to, maybe my lead up was too long, but this is the point I think that's so important. People who want to work in tech in New York are by and large New Yorkers first. They care about the things that all New Yorkers care about first. And that's true for tech. I think that's true for tons of other industries. It's true for, for all types of people. And I think the sooner we recognize that actually by and large, people who live in New York care about mostly the same things, safety is key among those things. They want to live in a clean environment. They want to have good schools. They want their kids, as they're raising kids, to be able to go outside. They want to be able to get places without being stuck in traffic for hours and hours. Like all of these things taken together are the things we're talking about today. And so I'm really, I really, that's kind of where we're, as an organization, Tech NYC also comes at this from.
Yeah. Julie or Chris, did either of you want to weigh in on this before we open it up?
Well, we actually are an organization that endorses candidates, as a matter of fact, and we have been asking candidates, where they are on transportation because of how important it is for the environment. It's been one of our priorities at the state and city level, and it is something that we have been asking candidates about. And we put something on our candidate questionnaire, and we're encouraging people now to adopt the 25 by 25 platform. For the very reasons we've all been talking about. Obviously, we are more emphatic about the improvements for air quality and public health and fighting climate change. But we've also long been supporters for these very same reasons of the Safe Streets initiatives, right? Because we know in order for people to be more willing to take these alternative means of transportation and to be more comfortable walking around, they all need to be, streets need to be safe. People need to feel safe out there. So we are very excited about that. We're excited that we have seen some people talking about bike lanes and networks and bus lanes and networks because we know this is something that will be very helpful. I think one thing we like to see more discussion of by our candidates is congestion pricing. That's obviously something our groups all work together on to help get enacted at the state level. The Trump administration really slowed that down. We know now that the new DOT commissioner, Secretary Buttigieg, has indicated that they are going to move forward with New York's request for that. So that's very exciting, but we're going to need a partner in New York City, and we expect the next mayor and the next council to be working with the state and the MTA as it moves forward. So we are excited though, and we are going to be judging candidates on what they're going to plan, what their plans are for transportation.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, yeah, I mean, we've been looking, we've been kind of aware of the way the candidates are responding, even to the recent release of the 25 by 25 report, and noticing pretty wide, support for, a shift away from cars and openness to the ideas of the report and creating more pedestrian spaces, and a shift away from cars, car devoted street space is good for people with disabilities, and people with disabilities represent a group of nearly 1 million New Yorkers, half of which are working age New Yorkers between 18 and 64, which represents about 10% of the working population of the city. And again, as we are recovering from COVID and looking to rebuild the city in whatever form that looks like, we want to ensure that the people with disabilities have every opportunity to participate in the rebuild and everything that the city has to offer. So supporting supporting a kind of reallocation of all this space for pedestrian spaces, as well as protected bike lanes and bus lanes is a great win for people with disabilities, as well as all New Yorkers.
Thank you. I know we're joined a little bit late, but very happy to have you. Yesenia, are you with us?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Apologies, there was an emergency hearing that I had to be on, and one of the things is this specific emergency hearing had to deal with specifically on ensuring that organizations, right, that La Colmena, we don't lose funding, that we don't lose the support from the city in order for us to continue managing. And the reason I'm very excited to also be on this call is because a lot of the times when people think about immigration, right, they think, or the Latino community, they always think, oh, they only care about immigration. They only care about this specific issue. And I really always like to emphasize that when it comes to specifically the Latino community, the immigrant community, no, we care about so many other things. We care about education, we care about housing, and we care about the specific issue. When the pandemic began, we started seeing how many small businesses, right, started shutting down. And one of the things that restaurant owners would tell me was like, I want to do the same thing like they do in Brooklyn. I want them to be able to shut down a street, and maybe we're able to continue providing services to continue functioning our restaurant. What if we put tables outside? And that would be easier. That would help us out a lot. So when I did talk to various immigrant businesses about this specific topic, they started saying, oh, well, this open streets is a great idea for us to continue, specifically here in Port Richmond. But as well, when it comes to there's a very interesting topic where you all had mentioned about how 75% of the space is always devoted to driving and to free storage of cars. But when it comes to minorities here in New York, many of them do own fewer cars. And there's a lot of the times where many of them do end up taking bicycles to work. And I specifically work with the day laborers. And a lot of the times, many of them come to La Colmena with their bikes. And they always say, hey, it would have been easier for me if there was a bicycle lane for me to get from point A to point B, but there's no bicycle lanes here. Specifically here in Port Richmond, it's very difficult. But when you do go to the South Shore on that specific area, there are bike lanes. And I, at one point, would live in the South Shore. And it was easier for me to get from point A to point B because I would see bicycle lanes. But when it comes to areas like the North Shore, areas in Port Richmond, areas where there's Latino and Black communities, immigrant communities, there is no access to transportation like that, to bike lanes. That is something that we need here. That is something that many workers, essential workers, when it comes to restaurant workers, domestic workers, day laborers, they say it would have been easier had there been open streets. It would have been easier had there been like bicycle lanes for us. And it's important to have, and as I said, I'm really excited to be on this phone call because now it allows us to bring these voices who usually always use bicycles to get from point A to point B, that are usually forgotten, and also another voice to show that when it comes to Latino and immigrant community, we just don't care about immigration. We care about important issues like this. And thank you for starting this conversation. Thank
you. We're so glad that we could have you, have all of you. So if we turn to the questions, we have the first one that comes from Darcy, and she says, are the ideas for what we could do with 25% of street space taken away from cars mutually exclusive? Like, could we have 20 million square feet of bike parking and 80-foot zone on every block for delivery use? Or are these individually that would take up? So Darcy, to your point, if you look in our methodology of the report, this is, again, a sort of a hypothetical of all of the things that we could have, and everything that's listed here would all be included, and there would still be space left over. So we sort of mapped out square footage and lane miles. And so everything you're seeing here could be, you wouldn't have to sort of choose one over the other. So it's a great long laundry list. And again, this is just it's a lot, but this is just 25% of street space. We're not asking for all of it. We're not asking for 75% of it. We're not even asking for half of it. This is what we see as a first step in order to try to address some of those inequities. Let's see. So I wanted to ask, and maybe Sunny, I can ask you this one, but when we are, and especially in response to some of what you heard from the businesses and local organizations that need more space, I know a lot of the concern, especially around open streets, is like, who would maintain this space? So I'm curious if you have a sense of, whether it's from, what you're hearing about from the restaurant owners or from others, as what are some of the tools that you think would be helpful for the city to provide, especially as streets are giving back to people, of how people can maintain it and make it effective and inviting?
Yes, I think so. Before I answer that question, one of the things is that we did a study during the pandemic to show the contribution of immigrant workers here on the island. And we discovered that 75% of their income goes to transportation and also to their rent. And at times, as I said, right, they had mentioned, hey, had there been bicycle lanes for us to get, again, from point A to point B, it would have been a lot easier, especially during the pandemic when many immigrant essential workers were forgotten. And that was one of the things that with La Colmena, we were able to distribute economic support to them in order for them to continue providing for their families, because there was so many job losses. And as well, again, there wasn't no economic support, no stimulus check from the government. So that is one thing. But as well, when it comes to businesses, the first thing that the city can do is actually come and talk to the businesses. One of the things was that we discovered how the city was inefficient. And that's actually one the hearing that I was in specifically, that we talked about how inefficient the city was when it came to speaking with the business, specifically here in Port Richmond, majority immigrant-owned businesses. Many of them where there was a language barrier. There was some of them weren't tech savvy, but as well, they didn't know who to connect. And that, as La Colmena, that was my job, to go and provide the support to them, the resources that they needed. So for the first thing that the city can do is actually start talking to these businesses, start communicating with them. One of the things is that many of them just wanted to be able to have a space. Like during the weekend, they would say, hey, it would be great if just during the weekend we could do something like this. We can take care of it, but no one comes and talks to us. And that is one of the things that, again, when I say, like, when it comes to immigrant voices, specifically here in Port Richmond, they are never included. And again, I think this is an entire conversation where when I did talk to a couple of them, like, hey, I'm going to join this panel. They started understanding, like, oh, this is something doable. This is something that we could also be part of. Again, many people leave the immigrant voices out. They leave specifically Port Richmond out because they're immigrant-owned businesses, and they're actually one of the businesses that have been struggling a lot. Again, because there's language barriers, again, because there's many are not as tech savvy, but there's no connection. They don't know who to connect with, or they don't have access to certain things. So one, the city can start outreaching to them and start communicating with organizations like La Colmena and with you all too, to get more knowledge on how this is something that can be beneficial for Staten Island. If businesses profit, then the neighborhood profits. So that is the first step, is talk to you all, and also for the city to start talking to these small businesses in their language.
Thank you. Julie, Ty, and Julie Samuels, I'm going to try to maybe adjust one of these questions in some of the things that you talked about, but there's a question that asks about, estimates of, recovery time or economic impact of these types of changes. I'm curious from either of your perspective, whether it's for, Julie Samuels, as you'd mentioned about, the need to continue to attract and retain people and businesses, and Julie, Ty, obviously, as you look at the economic climate change and how close or far away we are based on estimates. I'm just curious from each of your perspectives, if you have a window into, the cost of not taking change. And I don't know if that leans on some research you've already done or even just some qualitative pieces, but Julie, Ty, can I start with you just to kind of get a sense of some of the windows for change, especially as it relates to climate in New York?
Sure. So the state of New York has established a goal of reducing emissions 100%, to trying to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, which seems like a long time, but when you look at the lead time of how long it takes to make change and what we're looking at, it's not really all that long at all. And the goal in the short term is to reduce emissions 40% by 2030, which is only 10 short years. And of that, the transportation sector needs to reduce emissions by about 30%, 30 to 33%, to try and help us meet those objectives. So we have a relatively short time frame, and we need to do a lot of things with that. Right? We need to be moving towards zero emission vehicles for the vehicles that are out there, including our buses. We need to get more people using mass transit in a big way. That's going to require, as Julie said, we're not going to redo all of our subways. There is some expansion of the Second Avenue subway. There are some opportunities above ground, but really much more cheaper and cost effective will be to increase the amount of buses that are available and making the buses that we have available much more reliable by having these buses, these protected bus lanes or these dedicated bus lanes. So certainly from that perspective, we have to act on that front, but we also need to move people out of those cars and onto alternative options like bikes and scooters. I don't have a financial number on that, but if we don't act, the cost will be billions and billions of dollars of impacts, as we've all seen from things like Superstorm Sandy. New York being a community that's coastal will be a very much greater risk of impacts from coastal flooding.
I also don't have hard economic numbers, but I do have a couple data points and some anecdotal evidence that this really matters to the tech community. We did a poll recently that it hasn't been put out in the public, but one takeaway I can give you guys is that over half of polled New Yorkers who work in tech said that they would consider leaving New York one day. And the things that they care about are not, it's not like, I feel like the tech community is not a traditional business community, at least not yet. And I don't know if it ever will be, but the factors that would push people who work in tech to leave are not just like high taxes and these business issues, but it's things, again, about livability, about being, like, having a New York experience. And so things like congestion, things that make living here just really, really unpleasant are the kinds of things that are going to push people out. So we do have some data that show that. And I think that's really interesting. The flip side of that coin is the only large employers who have publicly doubled down on New York in the past calendar year, since March of 2020, who've signed new commercial leases, who've committed to hiring more New Yorkers, are large tech employers. And that's meaningful because, they're committing to New York in a way that is important. And so when you take these two pieces together, it's actually a pretty rosy outlook, I think. It shows that tech jobs will drive our economy, and there's a lot we'll do and talk about that isn't necessarily part of this conversation. Happy to discuss that with anyone who wants to at another time. But it's all to say that while that rosy outlook is a good thing, if we don't get this stuff about our streets right, if we don't get the stuff about our schools right, if we don't get the stuff about, raising families in New York right for all of New Yorkers, we could quickly derail that progress. And so that's why it's so important that we double down on these issues, that we make sure that the streets are accessible, for instance, for New Yorkers, particularly New Yorkers who are raising families, I think. Obviously, I care about that because I am doing that in the city.
Yeah. Your background suggests that you have, yeah. I just want to give a shout out, if I can, to Guillermo Penaloza, who's on the call. He was the founder of 880 Cities and has really been instrumental in sort of pushing for this type of change around the world. I was really fortunate to have learned from him when I was at the Knight Foundation, and his work with 880 Cities has really been sort of integral in some of this work. So I just want to acknowledge him for being on this call and for his comment, and just for helping to lead the charge on some of this change, which hopefully will start to come to New York at more scale. So Christopher, maybe I can close with you. In terms of thinking about, some of these changes, especially as it relates to community feedback, recognizing that a number of these street changes are going to change not just the dynamic of how streets are, but also how people who may have impairments, especially say visual impairments, get around the city. Can you talk about, in your mind, how you can bring about, systemic change to our street space that brings in the disability community, especially recognizing the diversity of disabilities, but also that doesn't sort of overwhelm individuals either as part of the engagement process, but just to ensure that these changes happen in a way that communities, they do feel a part of it, but they're also not going to be negatively impacted by what some of those changes will mean on their own streets and intersections.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think, I think it's kind of what we're doing here today. Is when there's energy for change. It's having the voice of the disability community, kind of pushing and representing for those interests. So when there's efforts to kind of expand pedestrian spaces, as in the 25 by 25 report, or in efforts to, I know currently there's the city is running a pilot soliciting kind of interest from companies to provide e-scooter options to tackle micro mobility issues, and to ensure that people with disabilities are able to weigh in on that process when the city is selecting companies that will provide these e-scooters, to make sure those companies are thinking about people with disabilities in developing products. That's just one example, and kind of take that and extrapolate it to whenever there's energy, whenever companies are bringing in new products, when micro mobility is kind of an important topic these days. I think with some of the struggles of the subway system, and other issues related to COVID, and so these issues are creating opportunities in other areas, and so long as people with disabilities are present to weigh in, then that's really an important thing.
Well, I want to thank you all, Julie Samuels, Christopher Schuyler, Julie Tai, Yesenia Mata. I want to thank all of you and the organizations that you represent for the great work that you're doing, and for standing with us. I think we all see together that we're stronger together, and most importantly, we're stronger when we look at shared assets that support our city's recovery. And so I'm grateful for all of your support and the hard work of being in the trenches with us and on your issues. For everybody on the call, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, please go to our website, nyc25x25.org. You'll see a report that I hope will have a lot of data that is useful for you in whatever work you're doing, a coalition that we invite you to come join. And most importantly, we hope that you have some talking points now, so that as you're engaging with candidates, you can raise your view on the importance of street space, and specifically thinking about how streets can benefit all New Yorkers, especially our most vulnerable. So with that, just a huge amount of gratitude again for all of you, and please come join us in the fight. We have a lot of work to do and a long way to go to get to 25 by 25, but we're really heartened by a week of success so far. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon. Bye, everybody. Thank you.